Randy Couture. Randy Couture makes his UFC debut at UFC 13 in 1997, and over the next 14 years racks up 24 fights, becoming both a three-time heavyweight champion and a two-time light heavyweight champion. He defies time itself by making successful comebacks at ages 43 and 44, beating younger opponents who probably hadn't even grown chest hair when he debuted. His calm, wrestling-heavy style earns him the nickname Captain America, though some joked it should have been Captain Midlife Crisis after he kept retiring and unretiring. Couture's ability to grind down fighters half his age makes him a cult hero. Nothing says inspiration like watching your dad out-wrestle 20-somethings on pay-per-view. His final UFC fight comes at UFC 129 in 2011, where Lyoto Machida ends his career with a front-kick KO that looks like it was borrowed from a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. Couture retires with a record as one of the most durable fighters in UFC history. Frank Mir debuts at UFC 34 in 2001 and spends the next 15 years locking heavyweights in submissions they didn't even know existed. By 2004, he snaps Tim Sylvia's arm in their title fight at UFC 48, forcing a stoppage before Sylvia even realized the limb was dangling like a loose car antenna. Mir's rise stalls after a near-fatal motorcycle accident in 2004, sidelining him until 2006, when he returns heavier, slower, but still capable of twisting ankles and egos. His comeback peaks at UFC 81 in 2008, where he submits Brock Lesnar in the first round, handing the WWE superstar his first MMA loss. Over 27 UFC fights, Mir collects 16 wins, including 9 submissions, a record for heavyweights at the time. He also holds the odd distinction of being both a giant killer and a punching bag depending on the night. Retiring in 2016, Mir leaves as one of the UFC's ultimate Ironmen, proving that breaking bones was his true cardio routine. Diego Sanchez. Diego Sanchez storms into UFC history by winning the Ultimate Fighter 1 in 2005, cementing himself as the franchise's first chaotic wildcard. Over 32 UFC appearances, he bounces between 4 weight classes like a man browsing buffet tables. Lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, and even featherweight, because apparently cutting weight was just another fight. His most famous performance comes against Clay Guida at Tough 9 Finale in 2009, a blood-soaked war so intense the octagon looked like a crime scene. Later that year, Sanchez earns a lightweight title shot at UFC 107, only to be picked apart by BJ Penn in a one-sided masterclass that ended with a doctor stoppage. Sanchez is remembered for his intensity, screaming "yes" on repeat like a malfunctioning hype machine before fights. His career spirals into a mix of highlight wins, odd decisions, and eventually a bizarre coaching controversy that leads to his release in 2021. From a historic tough winner to one of the UFC's most unpredictable Ironmen, Sanchez proves toughness sometimes counts more than tactics. Jim Miller debuts at UFC 89 in 2008, and by 2023 he racks up his record-breaking 43rd Octagon appearance, making him the definition of a UFC Ironman. Competing exclusively at lightweight, he spends 15 years trading punches, takedowns, and submissions with almost every notable name in the division. Miller's durability is legendary. He collects multiple submission wins while somehow surviving wars that would have sent most fighters straight into retirement paperwork. He also sets the all-time record for most UFC wins at lightweight, a stat that cements him as the division's permanent landlord. At this point, it feels like the UFC should just give him a parking spot inside the cage. Even after battling Lyme disease during his career, Miller continues to fight at a high level, proving toughness runs deeper than fight night hype. Still active as of 2023, Miller's Ironman streak shows no signs of slowing, which is bad news for every hungry lightweight prospect trying to use him as a stepping stone. Next comes Donald Cowboy Cerrone, the man who built an equally absurd resume by never saying no to a fight. Donald Cerrone debuts at UFC 126 in 2011 and proceeds to cram 37 fights into just over a decade, the kind of schedule that makes athletic commissions nervous. He racks up 23 UFC wins, the most at the time, and adds 16 finishes, proof that his gunslinger nickname isn't just for branding. Cerrone also pockets 6 fight night bonuses in 2015 alone, essentially making him the UFC's Employee of the Month for an entire year. His willingness to fight anyone, anytime, and sometimes on 2 weeks' notice earns him both fan respect and a reputation as the company's favorite short-notice solution. Dana White probably had Cowboy on speed dial labeled "in case of emergency." By the time he retires after UFC 276 with a loss to Jim Miller, Cerrone has fought in 4 divisions, headlined multiple cards, and left fans with highlight reels longer than most careers. Clay Guida makes his UFC debut at UFC 64 in 2006 and somehow turns relentless cardio, non-stop scrambles, and hair that looks like it's been electrocuted into a trademark. By 2023, he racks up 34 UFC fights, a number that screams professional octagon tenant. His biggest career highlight comes in 2011 when he submits former WEC champion Anthony Pettis at the Ultimate Fighter 13 finale, proving that relentless pressure can smother flashy kicks. 2 years earlier, his 2009 brawl with Diego Sanchez earns Fight of the Year honors, a contest where both men look like they were powered by car batteries. Guida's hair alone probably absorbed more strikes than some fighters' chins. Despite passing 40, Guida remains active in the UFC, still bouncing around the cage like he's running late for a bus. His longevity sets the stage for another heavyweight Ironman, Andrei Arlovski, who shows that sticking around isn't just for lightweights with endless cardio. Andrei Arlovski debuts at UFC 28 in 2000, rocking a mullet, fangs on his mouthguard, and enough hair gel to qualify as a weapon. By 2023, he collects 39 UFC fights, which is basically a mortgage worth of cage time. He wins the interim heavyweight title in 2005 by beating Tim Sylvia, then loses it back in their trilogy because apparently those two just couldn't quit each other. He leaves the UFC in 2008, comes back in 2014, and somehow keeps winning decisions well into his 40s. At this point, the commission should test his birth certificate, not his urine. Arlovski's chin has been cracked, rebuilt, and put back on warranty, yet he still hangs around proving cardio doesn't age if you fight like a cautious accountant. Nate Diaz debuts in the UFC by winning the Ultimate Fighter 5 finale in 2007, immediately proving he can choke people unconscious while also making them feel bad about it. Over the years, he racks up 27 UFC fights across lightweight and welterweight, blending Stockton slap boxing with marathon cardio. His biggest shockwave comes at UFC 196 when he submits Conor McGregor on 10 days' notice. Then calmly announces, "I'm not surprised," which instantly becomes merch fodder. Diaz is also a magnet for post-fight chaos. He's brawled backstage, flipped off opponents mid-scramble, and rolled up blunt references in pressers. At this point, his suspensions list might be as long as his submission record. He leaves the UFC in 2022 after tapping Tony Ferguson at UFC 279, reminding everyone he can still strangle veterans while looking like he just rolled out of bed. His exit closes a chapter defined by chaos, comedy, and chokeholds, setting up the next Iron Man who thrives on unpredictability. Demian Maia debuts at UFC 77 in 2007, immediately pulling opponents into a jiu-jitsu clinic that feels less like a fight and more like a Brazilian grappling seminar. Across 33 UFC bouts, Maia becomes the promotion's gold standard for submissions, racking up 14 tap-outs and forcing strikers to look like they just wandered into the wrong class. He challenges for titles at both middleweight and welterweight, though his suffocating ground game doesn't always impress judges or fans looking for highlight reel knockouts. In 2017, Maia outgrapples Jorge Masvidal in a title eliminator, proving that even game-bred can't out-scramble a black belt who treats the octagon like his living room. Yes, Maia often looked like he was trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while mounted on people's backs. He retires after UFC 263 in 2021, with a reputation as the UFC's most polite strangler. Charles Oliveira debuts at UFC Live 2 in 2010, a 20-year-old Brazilian prospect who looked like he still should have been carded at weigh-ins. By 2023, he racks up 31 UFC fights and carves out a legacy as the promotion's all-time finisher, with 19 stoppages and 16 submissions, records that make grapplers and strikers equally nervous. He claims a lightweight championship in 2021, stopping Michael Chandler at UFC 262, then defends against Dustin Poirier with a choke that looked almost casual. Oliveira's highlight reel becomes absurd. Guillotines, rear naked chokes, standing knockouts, and opponents who suddenly realize they've made a terrible life choice on the mat. Even Joe Rogan ran out of ways to say, "This guy is dangerous everywhere." In 2022, he loses his belt on the scale at UFC 274, missing weight by half a pound, an indignity only MMA could deliver. Michael Bisping. Michael Bisping storms into the UFC by winning the Ultimate Fighter 3 finale in 2006, instantly becoming Britain's loudest contribution to MMA since pub brawls. Across 29 UFC fights, he builds a career out of pressure, durability, and trash talk, so nonstop the commission probably should have docked him for excessive volume. In 2016, he shocks the world at UFC 199 by knocking out Luke Rockhold on short notice, proving sometimes a left hook and pure stubbornness beat every game plan. Later that year at UFC 204, he defends his belt against Dan Henderson, finally avenging the UFC 100 knockout that haunted him like a bad ringtone. The craziest part? He does much of this run half-blind, fighting with one good eye. Basically, the UFC's only pirate champion, eye patch not included. He even admitted he once sparred by accidentally punching the ref because of depth perception. He retires in 2018 after losing to Kelvin Gastelum, but his Iron Man status endures. Alexei Oleinik makes his UFC debut at Fight Night 57 in 2014, but by then he's already been fighting professionally since 1996, which means he has sparring sessions older than some current champions. Across 17 UFC bouts by 2023, the Russian heavyweight becomes known as the boa constrictor, strangling opponents with rare Ezekiel chokes, sometimes even while mounted, a move so absurd it looks like a prank gone wrong. He racks up over 60 professional wins, proving longevity in MMA is possible if you don't mind ice baths and Russian genetics. By his mid-40s, he's still competing, making him the oldest active UFC heavyweight, a title almost scarier than world champion. At weigh-ins, younger fighters sometimes look like they're facing their dad's training partner. His career shows that while speed fades, weird chokes and stubborn toughness don't. Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier makes his UFC debut at UFC 125 in 2011, fighting like someone who just remembered he left gumbo on the stove. By 2023, he stacks up 28 UFC fights, practically paying rent inside the octagon. He grabs interim lightweight gold at UFC 236, battering Max Holloway in a 5-round war that looked less like MMA and more like two dudes agreeing to ruin each other's weekend plans. In 2021, Poirier cements his legend by beating Conor McGregor twice, first with punches, then by letting Conor's ankle fold like a cheap lawn chair. No refunds, no exchanges. With 15 UFC finishes and a bank account full of fight night bonuses, Poirier proves you can fight at elite level and still sell hot sauce on the side. He remains in the lightweight top 5, basically the division's forever bridesmaid. But hey, at least he never shows up late to the party. Neil Magny. Neil Magny shows up at the TUF 16 finale in 2013, and from there he basically never leaves. 30 UFC fights later, you wonder if he secretly sleeps in the octagon between cards. At welterweight, he ties Georges St-Pierre's record for most wins in the division, but instead of doing it with flashy spinning kicks and huge paydays, he does it with pure cardio, long limbs, and the availability of a Domino's delivery driver. He beats former champs like Carlos Condit and Robbie Lawler, which sounds incredible, until you remember those guys were already halfway toward their retirement speeches. Magny's fighting style is simple but effective. Drown you in volume, clinch you against the cage, and make you question your career choices, kind of like bad speed dating, but with elbows. He earns a reputation as the UFC's ultimate short-notice replacement, which is great for Dana White, but terrible for Neil's vacation plans. Fans joke that if someone trips at the weigh-ins, Magny is already in the locker room warming up. By 2023, he's still going, proving that while champions come and go, Neil Magny is forever. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks for watching.